In 2006, a philosophy professor published a book that argued something most people find unthinkable: that coming into existence is always a harm, that being born is bad for you, that every birth is a tragedy, not because of circumstances, not because of poverty or war or disease, but because existence itself, any existence, is worse than non-existence. The professor's name is David Benatar, and his argument, laid out systematically in Better Never to Have Been, is so rigorous, so carefully constructed, so difficult to refute, that it's been called the most disturbing philosophical position ever seriously defended. This isn't emotional reasoning. This isn't depression talking. This is cold logic, careful analysis, step-by-step demonstration that creating a new person is always harmful to that person, that procreation is harm, that parents, no matter how loving, no matter how well-intentioned, inflict existence on someone who cannot consent, and that existence, once inflicted, guarantees suffering, guarantees harm, guarantees that this new person will experience pain they would never have experienced if they simply hadn't been born. Benatar doesn't argue that life is always worse than death. He argues something more subtle, that coming into existence is always worse than never existing in the first place. The difference matters. Once you exist, death might be bad, might be harmful, might be something to avoid. But before you exist, there's no you to be harmed by not existing. No you missing out on the pleasures of life. No you suffering the absence of good things. Just nothing. And nothing, Benatar demonstrates, is better than something when that something includes guaranteed suffering. This is antinatalism, the philosophical position that assigning positive value to birth is a mistake, that creating new sentient beings is ethically wrong, that the right number of children to have is 0. Not because children are burdens on parents, not because of overpopulation or environmental concerns, but because existence harms the one who exists, because birth is bad for the person being born. Before we examine Benatar's argument, understand what you're about to encounter. This isn't philosophy that makes you feel better. This isn't wisdom that helps you live well. This is systematic demonstration that something almost everyone does, something almost everyone thinks is good, is actually harmful. If you're ready to question the most fundamental assumption, the belief that creating life is valuable, then subscribe to the Hidden Codex. Turn on notifications, because Benatar's argument is rigorous, disturbing, and extremely difficult to dismiss. Once you understand it, you can't ununderstand it, and it changes how you see every birth, every pregnancy announcement, every decision to have children. Let's begin. David Benatar is a professor of philosophy at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. He's written extensively on ethics, death, and the value of existence, and in 2006, he published the argument he's best known for, the asymmetry argument. It's called this because it identifies an asymmetry in how we evaluate the presence and absence of pain versus the presence and absence of pleasure. And this asymmetry, once you see it, leads inexorably to the conclusion that existence is worse than non-existence. Here's how it works. Consider a possible person, someone who could exist but doesn't yet. Now compare two scenarios. Scenario 1. This person comes into existence. They will experience pleasures and pains, good things and bad things, joy and suffering. This is what existence is, a mixture of positive and negative experiences. Scenario 2. This person never comes into existence. They never experience anything. No pleasures, no pains, nothing. Now, let's evaluate these scenarios. In Scenario 1, the presence of pain is bad. this seems obvious. Suffering is bad. Pain is something to avoid. Everyone agrees on this. The presence of pleasure is good, also obvious. Enjoyment is good. Pleasure is something to seek. Again, universal agreement. In scenario 2, the absence of pain is good, even though there's no one to enjoy this absence. Even though there's no person benefiting from not suffering, the absence of suffering is still good. This is where it gets interesting. The absence of pleasure is not bad. This is the key. If a person doesn't exist, they're not deprived of pleasure. They're not missing out. There's no one there to be deprived. So the absence of pleasure, when there's no person to experience it, is not bad. It's just not good. It's neutral. Now compare the scenarios. Scenario 1 has bad things, the presence of pain, and good things, the presence of pleasure. Scenario 2 has good things, the absence of pain, and neutral things, the absence of pleasure that's not bad because there's no one to be deprived. Scenario 2 is better. It has something good, no pain, and nothing bad. Scenario 1 has something bad, the pain, even though it also has something good, the pleasure. The absence of pain is always good. The absence of pleasure is only bad if there's someone who exists to be deprived of it. Since the non-existent person doesn't exist, they're not deprived. So non-existence avoids badness, pain without creating badness, deprivation of pleasure. Existence creates badness, pain, even though it also creates goodness, pleasure. This is the asymmetry, and from it, Benatar concludes, coming into existence is always a harm, not because the life will necessarily be terrible, not because suffering will outweigh pleasure, but because any suffering at all is bad, and that suffering could have been avoided if the person simply never existed. While the absence of pleasure for the non-existent person isn't a harm because there's no one there to be harmed by missing it. You might object. You might say, but what about all the good things in life? What about love, beauty, achievement, joy? Doesn't the possibility of experiencing these things make existence worthwhile? Benatar's answer is no, because those good things only matter if you exist. And if you exist, you also suffer. The good things don't cancel out the suffering. They coexist with it, and all of it could have been avoided. The non-existent person doesn't suffer the absence of good things, because there's no person there to suffer. This is crucial. We tend to think of non-existence as deprivation, as missing out. But you can't miss what you never had. You can't be deprived if you don't exist. The unborn aren't somewhere sad about not experiencing life. They're nowhere. They're nothing. And nothing doesn't suffer, doesn't lack, doesn't need. The asymmetry means that creating a person creates the possibility of suffering, which is bad, without creating a corresponding good, because the absence of that suffering isn't good for anyone in particular, while not creating a person avoids badness, suffering without creating badness, because the absence of pleasure isn't bad for the non-existent. Now, let's look at another asymmetry Benatar identifies. Our judgments about bringing people into existence reveal something. If you know a child will have a terrible life, filled with suffering and very little pleasure, you think it's wrong to bring that child into existence. You think it would be better if they were never born. This is universal. Everyone agrees that knowingly creating a life of extreme suffering is wrong. But what if you know a child will have a wonderful life, filled with pleasure and very little suffering? Do you think it's wrong not to bring that child into existence? Do you think you have an obligation to create them? Most people say no. You don't have a duty to create happy people. The absence of happy people isn't a problem that needs solving. This reveals the asymmetry in our intuitions. The presence of suffering is a strong reason not to create someone, but the presence of pleasure is not a strong reason to create someone. We care about preventing suffering in a way we don't care about creating pleasure. Why? Because suffering matters absolutely. Pleasure only matters relatively. Suffering is bad, whether or not anyone experiences the good of its absence. Pleasure is only good if someone exists to experience it. This asymmetry in our intuitions supports Benatar's argument. We already believe, implicitly, that creating suffering is more morally relevant than creating pleasure. That preventing a terrible life is mandatory, but creating a wonderful life is optional. And if creating wonderful lives is optional, then creating any lives is optional. And if it's optional, and if every life contains some suffering, then the default should be not to create, because creating always risks harm. Not creating never does. Benatar also argues that everyone's life contains much more suffering than we typically acknowledge. We have a psychological bias toward optimism. We overestimate the good in our lives and underestimate the bad. This is adaptive, helps us continue, helps us function, but it's not accurate. Think about the structure of daily life. You're hungry, that's suffering. Mild, but suffering. You eat. The hunger stops. That's not pleasure. That's relief from suffering. You return to neutral. Most of what we call pleasure is actually just relief from discomfort. Temporary cessation of suffering. You're tired. You sleep. You're thirsty. You drink. You're bored. You seek stimulation. You're lonely. You seek company. Almost all motivation is escape from negative states. True positive pleasure, experiences that are good in themselves rather than just relief from badness, is rare and brief, and suffering is guaranteed. Everyone experiences pain, physical pain, emotional pain, psychological suffering, anxiety, fear, grief, loss, disappointment, frustration, boredom, loneliness. These are inevitable. You can't live a human life without experiencing these things, many times, in many forms. And the worst suffering, the most intense pain, physical and emotional, exceeds in intensity the best pleasure. The worst moments of life are worse than the best moments are good. Torture is more intense than joy. Grief is more intense than happiness. Agony is more intense than pleasure. And everyone is vulnerable to the worst. Accidents happen, diseases occur, tragedies strike. You might avoid the worst suffering, but you might not. And creating a person means creating someone who might experience the worst, who definitely will experience significant suffering, who absolutely will die, and imposing all of this on someone who cannot consent. Benatar points out that if an adult were subjected to what we routinely subject children to, we'd call it abuse, forced into existence without consent, forced to go through childhood, which includes pain, fear, confusion, helplessness, forced to navigate adolescence with its insecurities and anxieties, forced into adult life with its demands and disappointments, forced to age, to decline, to face death, all without asking if they want any of it. We do this to every child, and we call it love, call it gift, call it blessing, when actually, from the child's perspective, it's imposition. They didn't ask to exist. They didn't choose the circumstances. They didn't consent to the risks. They're simply forced into a situation that guarantees suffering and might include horrors. And we think this is fine. Think this is good. Think this is what responsible adults do. But imagine a different scenario. Imagine you could bring an adult into existence, fully formed, conscious, and you told them what existence involves. Pain, suffering, aging, death, uncertainty, risk of terrible experiences, and you asked them, "Do you want this? Do you consent to exist?" How many would say yes? How many would choose to exist knowing what existence actually involves? Benatar suggests very few. Most would refuse, would choose non-existence over existence if given the choice, because existence is a burden. Consciousness is a problem. Living requires constant effort to avoid suffering and achieve temporary pleasures that fade, and it ends in death, which you know is coming, which you fear, which you spend your life avoiding, contemplating. Why would you choose this? The only reason people continue existing is because they already exist, and once you exist, stopping is difficult, frightening, violates biological imperatives. But that's not an argument for starting. That's just evidence that once the harm is done, undoing it is hard. Now, let's address the obvious objection. What about people who are glad they were born? Who say their life is good? Who claim existence is valuable? Benatar has two responses. First, this is the optimism bias. People are not reliable judges of their own lives. They overestimate the good and underestimate the bad. They compare their lives to others who are worse off and feel grateful. They adapt to suffering and call it normal. They find meaning in struggle and call it growth. They tell themselves stories about why their suffering was worth it. All of this is psychological coping, necessary to continue functioning, but not accurate assessment of whether existence is better than non-existence. Second, even if some people genuinely experience more pleasure than pain, that doesn't justify creating new people. Because you can't know in advance whether a particular person will be glad they were born. You're gambling, rolling dice with someone else's life, creating someone who might suffer terribly, who might experience the worst existence has to offer, who might curse you for bringing them into being. And you're doing this without their consent, imposing existence on them based on your hope that they'll eventually be glad you did. This is not ethical. This is harmful. Consider childbirth itself. The process of coming into existence is traumatic. Birth is violent, painful, terrifying. The infant is forced from safety into chaos, from warmth and darkness into cold and light and noise. They're handled, cut, cleaned, measured, all while experiencing their first sensations, which are probably overwhelming, possibly painful, definitely confusing. We don't remember birth, but that doesn't mean it wasn't harmful, doesn't mean it wasn't a traumatic introduction to existence, and it only gets harder from there. Childhood includes unavoidable suffering, falls, illnesses, fears, confusion, social difficulties, the vulnerability of being small in a world designed for adults. Adolescence adds social anxiety, identity confusion, hormonal chaos, romantic rejection, academic pressure. The transition to adulthood adds financial stress, career uncertainty, relationship challenges, the weight of responsibility, and aging brings decline, physical breakdown, loss of abilities, loss of people, increasing awareness of mortality, until death ends it. This is what you're giving someone when you create them, not a gift, a burden. Benatar also addresses the environmental argument for anti-natalism. Every person created consumes resources, produces waste, contributes to environmental destruction, creates a carbon footprint, increases demand for food, water, energy, space. In a world already strained by human population, creating more humans makes everything worse. But Benatar's focus is different. The environmental argument is about harm to others, to existing people, to ecosystems, to the planet. Benatar's argument is about harm to the person being created. Even if resources were unlimited, even if there were no environmental impact, even if adding one more person harmed no one else, it would still harm that person, because existence itself is the harm, not the consequences for others. The harm to the one who exists. This is person-affecting antinatalism, the claim that creating a person is wrong because it wrongs that person, harms them, violates their interests, even though they didn't exist to have interests before you created them. This seems paradoxical. How can you harm someone by creating them? They didn't exist to be harmed. Benatar's answer is that the harm occurs once they exist. You create someone. They exist. They suffer. The suffering is harm, and that harm wouldn't have occurred if you hadn't created them. So you caused the harm by creating them. The fact that they didn't exist beforehand doesn't mean you didn't harm them. It means you created someone who would be harmed, which is worse. You didn't just harm an existing person. You created a new person for the purpose of harming them, because you knew existence includes suffering, knew this person would suffer, and created them anyway. The consent issue is crucial. In any other context, doing something to someone without their consent is wrong, especially if it harms them. You can't perform medical procedures on people without consent. Can't make major decisions affecting their lives without consent. Can't impose risks on them without consent. But with procreation, consent is impossible. The person doesn't exist to give or refuse consent. So we skip it. We create them without asking. And then we claim this is fine, because they didn't exist to object. But that's not a justification. That's just admission that we're doing something we couldn't get consent for, and doing it anyway. Imposing existence, imposing the burden of consciousness, imposing guaranteed suffering, all without permission, because permission is impossible, and we treat this impossibility as permission, when actually it should be prohibition. Benatar argues that people have children for selfish reasons. They want the experience of parenting, want to pass on their genes, want someone to care for them in old age, want to feel their life has meaning, want to satisfy social expectations, want to make their partner happy, want to experience the joy of watching a child grow. All of these are reasons for the parent, not reasons for the child. The child doesn't benefit from being born. The child is burdened with existence. The parents benefit, get what they want, use the child to fulfill their needs, and call this love, call this gift, when actually it's use. It's creating someone to serve your purposes, to fill your needs, to give your life meaning, without asking them if they want to serve this function, without considering that they might prefer not to exist, rather than to exist as a means to your ends. Some people argue that life is a gift, that parents give the gift of life. Benatar rejects this completely. A gift benefits the recipient, gives them something they want or need, improves their situation. Life doesn't do this, because before birth there's no one to benefit, no one receiving anything, no situation being improved. After birth, there's someone who exists, who will suffer, who will die, who didn't ask for any of it. That's not a gift, that's an imposition, a burden, a curse disguised as blessing. The language of gift is propaganda, societal conditioning to make the procreation seem good, to hide the reality that creating life is creating suffering, is imposing existence on someone who cannot refuse, is gambling with someone else's well-being for your own satisfaction. Now, let's examine potential objections. One common objection is that without procreation, humanity goes extinct, and extinction is bad. Benatar asks, bad for whom? Bad for the currently existing people who would die anyway. They're not made worse off by humanity ending after they die. Bad for the non-existent future people. They won't exist to be harmed by not existing. Extinction means no more suffering, no more people experiencing pain. No more children being born into circumstances they didn't choose. No more deaths. No more grief. No more of the endless cycle of creating new sufferers to replace the ones who die. Extinction is only bad if existence is good. And Benatar's argument is that existence isn't good. That coming into existence is always a harm. So preventing future existence prevents future harm. Extinction would be good, not bad. Another objection is that Benatar's argument proves too much. If existence is bad, shouldn't existing people end their existence? Shouldn't we all commit suicide? Benatar distinguishes between coming into existence and continuing to exist. Coming into existence is always bad because it creates a person who will suffer. Continuing to exist might be good, neutral, or bad, depending on the particular life. Once you exist, death might be harmful, might be frightening, might deprive you of future goods, might hurt the people who care about you. The calculation changes. For existing people, life might be worth continuing even if it would have been better never to have started. This is the start-continue asymmetry. Better never to start, but once started, might be worth continuing. Not always. Some lives become so terrible that death is preferable, but often, continuing is better than dying, even though never existing would have been better than coming into existence. Another objection is that Benatar's asymmetry is wrong, that the absence of pleasure for non-existent people is bad, just as the absence of pain is good, that we should count it as a loss, as deprivation, as something bad. But who is deprived? Who is experiencing this loss? The non-existent person doesn't exist to be deprived. This is the key. Deprivation requires a subject, someone who is deprived. Missing out requires someone who is missing out. If there's no one, there's no deprivation, no missing out. The absence of pleasure for non-existent people is not bad, because there are no non-existent people. There's just absence. And absence, without a subject experiencing it as loss, is neutral, not bad. This is what makes non-existence better than existence. Existence creates suffering, which is bad. Non-existence doesn't create deprivation, because there's no one to be deprived. Some people argue that Benatar's pessimism about the quality of life is wrong, that most lives are good, that most people are happy, that suffering is outweighed by pleasure. Benatar disputes this, points to the optimism bias, points to the fact that people adapt to suffering and call it normal, points to the fact that we're psychologically designed to continue existing, so we tell ourselves stories about why existence is worthwhile. But even if you disagree, even if you think most lives are net positive, that doesn't refute the argument. Because some lives are terrible, some people suffer enormously, and when you create a person, you risk creating one of them. You risk creating someone whose life is dominated by suffering, whose existence is net negative, who wishes they were never born, and you make this gamble without their consent. Impose this risk on them. That's harmful. Even if most people win the lottery, playing lottery with someone else's life without their permission is wrong. Benatar also addresses the objection that his argument is counterintuitive, that it contradicts what most people believe, that it violates common sense. He agrees that it's counterintuitive, but being counterintuitive doesn't make an argument wrong. Many true things are counterintuitive. The Earth seems flat but isn't. The Sun seems to orbit Earth but doesn't. Common sense is often wrong, especially about things we're emotionally invested in. And procreation is something humanity is deeply invested in, biologically programmed to value, socially conditioned to celebrate. Of course, the argument that procreation is harmful seems wrong, seems counterintuitive, because accepting it would require overturning fundamental assumptions. questioning deeply held values, recognizing that something almost everyone does is actually harmful. That's not easy, not comfortable, but difficulty and discomfort don't make an argument false. They just make it hard to accept. The policy implications of anti-natalism are important to consider. Benatar does not advocate forcing people not to have children, does not support laws prohibiting procreation, does not think governments should coerce people into not reproducing, because coercion is harmful, and causing harm to existing people to prevent potential harm to non-existent people is unjustified. The existing people have interests, have rights, have the capacity to suffer from coercion. The non-existent people have none of these. So Benatar's position is that people should choose not to have children, should recognize the harm of procreation, should voluntarily refrain, but should not be forced. This is an ethical argument, not a political program, an attempt to change minds, not to change laws. But what about adoption? What about caring for existing children who need homes? Benatar supports this completely. Adoption doesn't create new people, doesn't impose existence on anyone. It helps existing people, existing children who already exist, who already have needs, who will suffer more without care. Helping them doesn't contradict antinatalism. It's consistent with it, because the harm of coming into existence has already occurred. These children exist. They will suffer, and suffering can be reduced by providing care, by giving them homes, by offering love. Adoption is harm reduction. Procreation is harm creation. Completely different ethical calculations. Antinatalism says don't create new people. Doesn't say don't care for existing people. In fact, caring for existing people becomes more important, because you're not creating new needs, just addressing the ones that already exist. What about meaning? What about the claim that having children gives life meaning? Benatar asks, why do you need meaning? Why is meaning necessary? And why should you create a new person, impose existence on them, just to give your life meaning? Use them as a tool, as a means to your psychological needs, without asking if they want to serve this function. This is instrumentalization, using another person, creating them specifically to use them, to fill a void in your life, to make you feel purposeful. That's not ethical, that's selfish. If you need meaning, find it elsewhere. In work, in art, in helping existing people. Don't create new people to use as meaning-making devices. Don't impose existence on someone just so you can feel your life matters. The emotional response to antinatalism is often hostile. People are offended by the suggestion that having children is wrong, that they harmed their children by creating them, that their existence might not be valuable. Benatar understands this reaction, acknowledges that the argument is deeply disturbing, threatens fundamental beliefs, challenges what most people hold most dear. But emotional reaction is not refutation. Being upset by an argument doesn't make it false. Being offended doesn't constitute a counterargument. If the logic is sound, if the premises are true, then the conclusion follows, regardless of how it makes you feel. Philosophy is about truth, not comfort, not protecting people's feelings, not validating choices they've already made. If having children is harmful, then people deserve to know, deserve to consider the argument, deserve to make informed choices, even if the information is uncomfortable, even if it challenges everything they believe. If Benatar's argument disturbs you, if you recognize the asymmetry between existence and non-existence, if you see that creating life means creating suffering without consent, then subscribe to the Hidden Codex, because we don't shy away from difficult arguments. Don't avoid uncomfortable truths. don't protect comforting illusions. We examine the darkest philosophical positions, the most challenging ideas, the arguments that question what everyone assumes. Next time, we'll explore something even more unsettling. Until then, consider what Benatar revealed, that every birth is a harm, that existence is worse than non-existence, that creating people is ethically wrong, not because of consequences, not because of circumstances, but because existence itself, any existence, guarantees suffering, imposes consciousness, inflicts being on someone who cannot consent. You didn't choose to exist. You were forced into being by parents who thought they were doing something good, who thought they were giving a gift, when actually they were imposing a burden, gambling with your life, risking your suffering, for their reasons, their needs, their desires, and now you exist, and you suffer, and you will die, and none of it was your choice. That's what birth is. That's what procreation does. That's what Benatar showed. Not with emotion, not with rhetoric, but with careful argument, with logical demonstration, with philosophical rigor. He showed that bringing someone into this world is a cruel act, not because the world is cruel, though it often is, but because existence itself is harmful, because consciousness is burden, because life is suffering, and imposing any of this on someone without their consent is wrong, always wrong, regardless of intentions, regardless of love, regardless of how well things turn out. Wrong because it's harm. Harm you could have prevented by simply not creating, by leaving potential people non-existent, where they suffer nothing, experience nothing, lack nothing, are deprived of nothing, because they are nothing. And nothing is better than something when that something includes guaranteed suffering and death. That's antinatalism. That's Benatar's argument. That's the truth most people cannot accept. Because accepting it means recognizing that almost everyone who has children is doing something harmful, that society celebrates harm, that we're biologically programmed to commit ethical violations, that the most natural thing in the world is actually wrong, and that recognition is unbearable. So most people won't accept it, won't examine it seriously, won't consider that it might be true. They'll reject it emotionally, defensively, without engaging the logic, without addressing the premises, without refuting the conclusion. They'll simply refuse, because the alternative is too disturbing, too destructive to fundamental beliefs, too challenging to how they've lived and what they've chosen. But refusing to engage an argument doesn't make it false, just makes you someone who won't look at truth, who protects comfortable illusions, who chooses denial over honesty. And maybe that's fine. Maybe that's necessary to continue. Maybe seeing clearly makes a continuation impossible. But the argument remains. Sound, rigorous, true, whether you accept it or not, whether you can bear it or not. Every birth is a harm. Every creation of a new person is an ethical violation. Every parent inflicts existence without consent, guaranteeing suffering, risking horror, for their own reasons. That's what Benatar proved. That's what antinatalism means. That's the conclusion logic demands. Better never to have been. Better not to create. Better to leave potential people non-existent, where they harm no one, and no one harms them,